Good evening. I'm Kathryn Smith, General Director of Madison Opera. Welcome to Opera Novice. Thank you for joining us as we reinvent what we normally do. Tonight's talk is on unfinished operas. As always, when I'm done with my presentation, we'll go to questions, which can be on anything, not necessarily the topic of this talk. Except not the election, please. If you are watching this live on November 5th, please type your questions into the YouTube comments box so I can see them. If you are watching this not live, feel free to email your questions to info@madisonopera.org. I'm always happy to chat after the fact. And yes, I'm keeping the random pet photos from the last time because it's 2020 and I'm here to distract you. So now we go to the sharing my screen bit. There are a few kinds of unfinished operas. There are ones that the composer was in the process of writing and almost completed. Perhaps the show was even in rehearsal. There are ones that the composers gave up on midway through the writing process for some reason, and ones that they just took forever to write and never finished. Operas can be considered permanently unfinished when the composer dies. And when the composer was famous, people often tried to finish their work. As seems to be my habit, we'll start with Mozart. We know and love his major operas, Figaro, Don Giovanni, Magic Flute, but he actually wrote 22 operas and left several unfinished before he got to his masterpieces. Our first such opera is now called Zaide, although that will be confusing because Mozart actually called the opera the Ceralio, and of course, that part of the title of a completely different opera he later wrote. But let's back up. It's 1778, Mozart is 22 years old and trying to make a living. He's past the child prodigy stage, and for operatic purposes, he has yet to have a hit show. In Vienna, Emperor Joseph II was setting up an opera company for the purpose of performing German opera, as opposed to the Italian operas that were standard. In order for Mozart to be hired by this new company, he had to write them a comic opera. So in 1779, he began work on a comic Singspiel, meaning an opera with spoken dialogue. It was called the Ceralio. As I warned you, a similar title to the opera he wrote a few years later, The Abduction from the Cerralio. Like that completed piece, the Cerralio tells of the rescue of enslaved Westerners from a harem, a popular theme at the time. In this case, the heroine is named Zaide, and she rescues her lover, the tenor. Mozart finished only the arias and ensembles from the first two acts, and then abandoned it a year later to compose Idomeneo for Munich. An opera serio, Idomeneo features a sea monster sent by Neptune to destroy the island of Crete, and was Mozart's first operatic hit. Historically speaking, then, the Ceralio/Zaide's best purpose was as an audition piece. Mozart played it for the administrators of Vienna's National Theater, which led to them hiring him for what became The Abduction from the Cerralio, a massive hit in 1782. Like Zaide, Abduction was a Singspiel set in Turkey, was about Westerners being rescued from a harem, and featured a comic-based character named Osmin. But that was the end of the similarities, as none of the music or plot from Zaide was part of Abduction. Zaide was lost until after Mozart's death, when his wife Constanza found it in his manuscripts. Johann Anton André completed what Mozart had called the Ceralio, renamed it Zaide, and published it. The opera's first performance was in 1866 on the 110th anniversary of Mozart's death. In modern times, various completions have been attempted using a pastiche of Mozart concert arias or music from Thamos, King of Egypt, a play for which Mozart had written incidental music. No one pretends to know how Mozart might have finished Zaide, and no one says that's the equivalent of a lost Don Giovanni, but it's still Mozart. Pause for a pet break. So staying on Mozart. As I said, The Abduction from the Cerralio was a smash hit in 1782. So the director of the Imperial Court Theater asked Mozart to compose a comic opera for the resident Italian opera company. In spring 1873, Mozart wrote to his father that he was still looking for a decent libretto to set, having rejected a number of them. He had recently met Lorenzo da Ponte, but he was busy writing for another composer, so Mozart reluctantly turned back to the librettist of Idomeneo, who he disliked. The result was called The Cairo Goose. It is about a young woman locked up in a tower by her father. She is rescued by her lover, who smuggles himself into the tower inside a large mechanical goose. By December 1873, Mozart had completed most of the first act, but he wrote of being dissatisfied with the libretto, and 2 months later, he abandoned it. We now have about 45 minutes of music that he composed for it. We think he began The Deluded Bridegroom shortly after this, and we know even less about that opera as only 20 minutes of the two-act comedy got written. The libretto was originally written for Cimarosa's 1780 opera, The Rival Women. So it was normal at the time for the same libretto to be set by multiple composers. There were 5 operas about the Barber of Seville. We don't know the plot of The Deluded Bridegroom, although its subtitle, The Rivalry of 3 Women for 1 Lover, probably explains it. We also don't know why Mozart abandoned the work, but it likely again had to do with a bad libretto. Plus, Lorenzo da Ponte eventually came up with the libretto to The Marriage of Figaro, and most of the cast intended for The Deluded Bridegroom wound up singing the leads in Figaro instead. Figaro premiered in 1786, and Mozart's opera career took off from there. There was no point in going back to either of these abandoned comedies. But no one is going to leave Mozart's music lying around. Remember that this is a man who once said, "Opera comes to me before anything else." So both the Cairo Goose and the Deluded Bridegroom have found their way into various kinds of performances over the years. Just a little friendly hello. Our next composer, Gaetano Donizetti, wrote almost 70 operas in 25 years. We're going to focus on an unfinished opera of his called The Duke of Alba. Its title refers to the third Duke of Alba, and its plot tells of a Spanish nobleman sent to Flanders to suppress the rebellion against Spanish rule. The Duke's long-lost son turns out to be the leader of the rebellion, of course, and there is the inevitable betrayal and accidental murder of the wrong man. It was commissioned by the Paris Opera in 1839, the year that Donizetti first broke through to success in Paris with the local premieres of Lucia di Lammermoor and The Elixir of Love. Donizetti worked on the Duke of Alba through most of that year, but abandoned it with only the first 2 acts completed, plus notes for acts 3 and 4. We're not sure why he abandoned it, but one scholar attributes it to the fact that soprano Rosine Stolz disliked the leading role. So digression, Rosine Stolz was a French soprano who started out as a chorus girl in Brussels. When she was 22, the leading tenor of the Paris Opera, who was singing in Brussels for the summer, arranged for her to debut in Paris. In the same year, she married the head of the Brussels Theatre after having given birth to his son. She quickly became one of the stars of the Paris Opera. She was also having an affair with the head of the company, who refused to produce any opera that didn't have a role for her, leading to problems with composers. She resigned from the opera in 1847 over a scandal over their relationship, and she was still only 32 years old. She later became the mistress of a German duke who gave her a castle, married a Spanish prince when she was 63, and died at the age of 88. Back to Donizetti. To put abandoning the Duke of Alba in perspective, in the period 1839 to 1840, Donizetti was writing 4 other operas, including The Daughter of the Regiment and Les Martyrs. So the Duke of Alba didn't matter. Donizetti died in 1848, and that seemed to be the end of that, the Duke of Alba being just one of 70 operas and not considered a lost masterpiece. But remember what I said about how librettos got used by multiple composers. In 1853, the Paris Opera paired Giuseppe Verdi, fresh off his hit La Traviata, with librettist Eugène Scribe and asked them to write a new opera. Scribe proposed a rewrite of the Duke of Alba libretto, which he had written. Verdi turned this into the opera The Sicilian Vespers, with the setting changed from the 16th century Spanish occupation of Flanders to the 13th century French occupation of Sicily. The opera premiered in 1855 and was a success. Fast forward to 1881, when Matteo Salvi, a former student of Donizetti's, completed the Duke of Alba using Donizetti's notes. The libretto was translated into Italian, and the lovers' names were changed as Verdi had already used the original names. Il Duco d'Alba premiered in 1882, then basically disappeared until the mid-20th century. Sometime in the early 1950s, Salvi's score was rediscovered and performed in concert. The same decade, conductor Thomas Shippers reworked it, removing Salvi's auditions and reconstructing the final acts on his own. It has been sporadically performed ever since in varying versions. Our next opera was technically completed by its composer before he died, but that's not what got performed. This is Lafrikan, the African Woman by Giacomo Meyerbeer. The plot tells of a fictional Vasco da Gama traveling from Lisbon, where he has brought two slaves from an undiscovered land, back to said undiscovered land, where Celica, one of the slaves, is in fact the queen, and their law includes the execution of all strangers. Celica, which is the title role, spares the lives of da Gama and his lover, and then she commits suicide. Oh, and there's a big shipwreck scene in the middle of the show, too. For background, Meyerbeer was one of the most successful opera composers of the 19th century. His works were the very definition of grand opera, merging German orchestral style with Italian vocal tradition, using melodramatic stories, all showcased by the elaborate theater technology of the Paris Opera. One of his greatest successes, Les Huguenots, is longer than and has a bigger cast than La Bohème and Tosca combined. Lafrikan's libretto was by Eugène Scribe, the same librettist as the Duke of Alba and the Sicilian Vespers. Librettists at the time were basically on staff at opera companies, and Scribe worked for the Paris Opera, who commissioned Donizetti, Verdi, and Meyerbeer. And indeed, Lafrikan overlaps our previous two operas as it had a very long history. Meyerbeer and Scribe signed a contract in 1837. The starting point was a French play about a Hindu woman in love with a Portuguese navigator. The lead role of Celica was intended for the sensational soprano Cornélie Falcon, who had gained massive acclaim in her 5 years as an opera singer. But she suddenly and completely lost her voice, disappearing from the stage permanently. So Meyerbeer set the project aside in summer 1838, shifting his focus to his opera Les Prophètes. He finished Le Prophète by the end of 1841, but refused to let it be staged because the head of the Paris Opera wanted Rosine Stolz to sing the lead role. So back to Lafrikan. By 1843, Meyerbeer had completed the first draft. At this point, the opera was set in Spain during the reign of Philip III, and the protagonist was a naval officer named Ferdinand. In Act 3, while sailing to Mexico, Ferdinand's ships are forced to seek shelter on the coast of Celica's kingdom in Africa. Meyerbeer then set the opera aside again. 8 years later, he was back at it with Scribe. Meyerbeer had just read an epic poem celebrating Vasco da Gama's discovery of a sea route to India. So their new version was called Vasco da Gama, and he was the protagonist. The first 2 acts took place in Lisbon, and the last 2 acts in India. After a year of work, they set it aside yet again. Meyerbeer returned to the opera in 1855. The role of Celica was now intended for Sophie Crivelli, but then she retired from the stage after marrying a baron. Incidentally, Crivelli had sung the lead in the premiere of Verdi's Sicilian Vespers, the one with the plot from the Duke of Alba. Meyerbeer began composing music for Vasco da Gama, aka Lafrikan, in 1857, and then worked on the opera almost continuously from 1860 onwards. Scribe died in 1861, and Charlotte Birch Pfeiffer provided revisions to the libretto. Sidebar, she was an actress and also wrote over 100 plays and libretti. She was also the head of the Zurich State Theater for 6 years. Back to Meyerbeer. He died in 1864 at age 72, one day after completing the full score of Vasco da Gama / Lafrikan. But having had a very long, very successful career, he knew what happened to new operas once they went into rehearsal. Substantial changes, including cuts, additions, and rearrangements. So he requested that Vasco da Gama not be produced if he died before it premiered. But the Paris Opera went ahead anyway, hiring someone else to turn the score into a performing version. They changed India to Madagascar so they could go back to the original title, Lafrikan. They changed the spellings of names, cut a lot of music, rearranged numbers, and added a ballet, because all operas in Paris had to have a ballet, quite seriously. Side story. Leo Delibes, future composer of Lakmé, was at the time the second chorus master of the Paris Opera. After the first music rehearsal of Lafrikan, he told the head of the opera that he thought it was terrible, and he was promptly fired. The opera premiered in 1865 and was an artistic sensation, built up by years of waiting for the piece. It had amazing sets, with each act designed by a different artist. Engravings of the sets appeared in periodicals across Europe. The emperor attended opening night, and a bust of Meyerbeer was formally unveiled on stage at the end of the performance. For the most part, critics called the production brilliant and said that the opera was Meyerbeer's masterpiece, although remember, not one he wanted presented. The Act III Shipwreck was deemed disappointing in person, possibly because nothing on stage can equal the imagination of a drawing. Lafrikan was a smash hit, and the Paris Opera performed it over 100 times in the first year. Within months of its premiere, it was produced in London, New York, and Italy. Like most of Meyerbeer's works, it went from massive popularity to disappearing from view by the mid-20th century. For example, the Metropolitan Opera performed it almost every season between 1888 and 1901, and again between 1923 and 1934, but has not performed it since. In 2013, a new version, now called Vasco da Gama, premiered in Germany. I'm going to jump back to Verdi briefly, not so much for an unfinished opera as for an opera that never was. I'm talking about King Lear. Verdi wrote a number of Shakespearean operas, from Macbeth to Otello to Falstaff, so it's not surprising that King Lear would fascinate him. Remember how much he liked writing about fathers and daughters, after all. He first commissioned a King Lear libretto from Salvador Camerano, writing to him in 1850. At first glance, King Lear is so tremendous, so intricate, that it would seem impossible to make an opera out of it. However, after examining it closely, it seems to me that the difficulties, great as they are not inseparable. You know, we need not turn Lear into the sort of drama that has been customary up to now. We must treat it in a completely new way, on a grand scale, without any regard for convention. Camerano died in 1852 before completing the libretto. 3 years later, while working with Antonio Soma on what eventually became A Masked Ball, Verdi proposed King Lear to him, and Soma started on a libretto. That project was abandoned. A decade later, Verdi again considered writing King Lear, this time for the Paris Opera. He kept thinking about writing King Lear until the end of his life, but he never wrote a note of music for it. It's not quite sweater weather outside anymore, is it? Okay, moving along chronologically, we get to the most popular and gloriously messy unfinished opera of all, Jacques Offenbach's The Tales of Hoffman. The plot is complicated, so here is a refresher. It starts with a prologue in a tavern where the poet Hoffmann promises to tell everyone the tales of his past loves. Each act is then one of the tales. The Olympia act, about falling in love with a mechanical doll. The Antonia act, about falling in love with a young woman who dies from singing. And the Giulietta act, about an affair with a courtesan who steals his reflection. Then there's an epilogue where Hoffmann basically passes out drunk and insults his current lover, the actress Stella. And each act also has a villain, played by the same baritone, and Hoffmann's friend Niklaus is also the muse of poetry. It's great stuff. Offenbach had been a massive success as the composer of almost 100 comic operettas, like Orpheus in the Underworld, which we will produce one of these days. Yet in the final years of his life, as his health was failing, he started working on this more serious opera. His partner was librettist Jules Barbier. Decades earlier, Barbier had co-written a play called The Fantastic Tales of Hoffman that had used as its protagonist E.T.A. Hoffmann, the famous German author and composer. The play made him its hero, using 3 of his short stories as the tales. Around 1873, Barbier turned his play into a libretto for Offenbach. The Paris Opera Comique agreed to produce the as yet unwritten opera, and Offenbach filled a notebook with musical sketches. Then the head of the Comique resigned, so Offenbach decided to put Hoffmann on at his own theater. But then his theater went into bankruptcy in 1877. Conductor Albert Visentini took over the theater and announced that Hoffmann would be performed in 1878. 6 months later, Visentini's theater went bankrupt. As you have probably heard me say before, running an opera company has never been profitable in the history of the world. So, Offenbach had the beginnings of an opera, but nowhere to put it on. He was now in his late 50s and conscious of his own mortality. He was heard saying to his dog, "I would give everything I have to be at the premiere." So in May 1879, he invited the head of Vienna's Ring Theater and the new head of the Opera Comique over to his house to hear parts of Hoffmann. The audition worked, and Hoffmann was again scheduled to premiere at the Comique. The head of the Comique promptly demanded changes, the major one being that the title role had to be rewritten for a tenor instead of the planned baritone. So that meant transposing all of Hoffmann's arias up and changing all of the ensembles accordingly. We are now into 1880, and Offenbach worked as fast as he could. At one point, he wrote to the head of the Comique, "Hurry up and stage my opera. I have not much time left, and my only wish is to attend opening night." Rehearsals finally began in September. The orchestration was unfinished, as was the end of the Giulietta act and the epilogue. On October 5th, after attending a morning rehearsal of a different show, Offenbach fainted. He died that evening. So what was left behind? The piano vocal score with the first 4 acts mostly complete and a sketch of the epilogue. Offenbach's family enlisted composer Ernest Guiraud to create an epilogue from the sketches and finish the orchestration. So now back into rehearsals where the real fun started. The character of Niklaus/the Muse was split into 2, as the mezzo cast into the role couldn't sing both parts. But the new mezzo cast as the Muse evidently couldn't sing at all, so her music was cut and replaced with dialogue. More problematically, the opera was simply too long. The final dress rehearsal lasted 4.5 hours. So they cut the Giulietta act down to just a few numbers. One day later, they cut the Giulietta act completely, putting some of its music into other acts and putting all of the cut music away in a box somewhere. Hoffmann finally opened on February 10, 1881. Despite all the cuts and the fact that it still lasted until midnight, it was an enormous success and spread swiftly around the world. But what exactly was the Tales of Hoffman? There was no definitive version, and each production did its own job of editing, adding, and deleting, particularly in regards to the Giulietta act. Some changes became standard for a while and then went away. For example, the order of the tales has changed and changed back. Offenbach's order was Olympia, Antonia, Giulietta, but for much of the 20th century, it was Olympia, Giulietta, Antonia. It's only in the past 20 years that it has switched back again. The music has changed too, as people continued to add music, some from that box shoved into a basement, some from other sources. For example, the villain has a fabulous aria in the Giulietta act called Senti Diamant. It first appeared in a 1905 production, using a tune from the overture to a completely different Offenbach opera. There is also a great sextet in the Giulietta act, and we have no idea where it came from or who wrote it. I think of Hoffmann as a choose-your-own-adventure opera. Offenbach never lived to finish it, but he left so much great music that every production describes and decides how it wants to proceed on its glorious adventure. I'm going to briefly jump to Russia a few years later and to an opera that I mentioned in my Opera and Politics talk, Khovanschina by Modest Mussorgsky. Based on an episode in Russian history concerning political and religious rebellion, it is your typical cheerful Russian opera, meaning it ends in a mass suicide. Mussorgsky worked on the piece for 8 years before he died in 1881. Here is the interesting part to me. After he died, another Russian composer, Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, completed and orchestrated the piece, and it premiered in 1886. In 1913, the impresario Sergei Diaghilev commissioned Igor Stravinsky and Maurice Ravel to do a new arrangement. But Fyodor Chelyabin, who was singing the leading role, refused to sing their version, so they performed a hodgepodge of versions. In 1959, another Russian/Soviet composer, Dmitri Shostakovich, revised the piece. This is the version most performed now, except that sometimes people use Stravinsky's finale. So that's one opera by 5 notable composers, which might be some kind of record. Claude Debussy was most well known as an orchestral composer, although his opera Pelléas and Melisande achieved acclaim, and we talked about it in the September Opera Novice. But Debussy was fascinated by Edgar Allan Poe and worked on 2 operas based on Poe's short stories. The first, The Devil in the Belfry, is a 1-act comedy. Debussy began it in 1902. The chorus was going to be the only singing part. The title character, the devil, would whistle instead of sing. Although he worked on it for a decade, all that remains is some musical sketches without text. Meanwhile, in 1908, Pelléas had its American premiere at the Manhattan Opera House, which was the rival of the Metropolitan Opera. So the head of the Met offered Debussy a contract to compose 3 operas, including The Devil in the Belfry, another Poe opera called The Fall of the House of Usher, and The Legend of Tristan, about which we know almost nothing. We have more of The Fall of the House of Usher. Excuse me while we have computer problems. I love PowerPoint. So we have more of The Fall of the House of Usher. The short story and the opera is a Gothic horror story about a twin brother and sister, Roderick and Madeline Usher. Madeline dies, Roderick puts her in the family tomb, and then basically goes mad. Madeline returns from the dead, or possibly she was never dead, and drags her brother to his death. The narrator watches as the House of Usher collapses into a lake under a blood-red moon. Sometime after signing the contract with the Met, Debussy wrote to a friend, "These days I have been working hard on the fall of the House of Usher. There are moments when I lose the feeling of things around me, and if the sister of Roderick Usher were to come into my house, I shouldn't be very surprised." In 1909, he wrote about finishing Roderick Usher's monologue, saying, "It almost makes the stones weep. As a matter of fact, it is all about the influence of stones on the minds of neurasthenic people." Pause for a definition. Neurasthenia was a major diagnosis in the late 19th and early 20th century, denoting a condition with symptoms of fatigue, anxiety, depression, headache, high blood pressure, and more. Its cause was said to be modern civilization, specifically urbanization and capitalism, and its cure was a rest cure. It was abandoned as a medical diagnosis by the mid-20th century. And no, I'm not going to insert the obvious joke about the year 2020. So in 1909, Debussy was diagnosed with colorectal cancer, but he kept working. He wrote 3 versions of a libretto and finally finished a draft of the music for the first scene and part of the second in 1917. He died of cancer the following year. The fall of the House of Usher lay aside until the 1970s, when 2 completions were done, the first in 1977 at Yale and the second in 1979 at Berlin. A 3rd version was done in 2004, and an expanded version was produced in 2019. Quite honestly, I don't think anyone is claiming it's a lost masterpiece, but obviously the story is very compelling, and Debussy's music seems well suited to Gothic melodrama. The Devil in the Belfry, which had considerably less completed music, was given a kind of premiere in 2012 in Montreal. This is just your regular reminder to wear a mask. Rivaling Hoffmann for most famous unfinished opera we actually still do is Turandot by Giacomo Puccini. Set in ancient/mythical China, the opera tells of the title princess and a prince's attempt to solve 3 riddles to force her to marry him. The Princess Arya Nessun Dorma is probably the most famous tenor aria out there, at least in terms of appearances on ads, at sporting events, and even at political ones. The libretto was based on an 18th century play of the same name by Carlo Gozzi. That, in turn, was based on one of the 7 stories in Haft Pekar by the 12th century Persian poet Nizami. Puccini started composing the music for Turandot in 1921. By March 1924, he had finished everything but a final duet. He didn't like the libretto for that scene and took until October to decide what text to use. That same month, he was diagnosed with throat cancer. Before heading to Belgium for radiation treatment, he visited his friend, Conductor Arturo Toscanini, and said, "Don't let my Turandot die." Puccini died a month later of a heart attack following treatment. The first 2 acts of Turandot were finished. The 3rd act was mostly complete. He left behind 36 pages of sketches and instructions that composer Riccardo Zandonai should finish the opera. But Puccini's publisher, Ricordi, chose Franco Alfano instead. Alfano first provided an ending to the opera that included music of his own, as well as some additions to the libretto. Ricordi and Toscanini objected, requiring that he write a 2nd version that followed Puccini's sketches more closely. This meant Alfano did not set some of the original libretto, as Puccini hadn't left notes on how he wanted it to sound. And if you've seen Turandot, this makes sense. The final scene of the opera is pretty weak dramatically, and Puccini is almost never weak dramatically. So the fact they skipped over part of the libretto might explain it. In addition, Ricordi explicitly wanted the end of Turandot to sound as if it had been written by Puccini, which might be why the opera basically ends with a reprise of Nessun Dorma. Turandot premiered at La Scala in 1926, conducted by Toscanini. The title role was sung by Rosa Raesa, who was the voice teacher of Giorgio Tozzi, who was Kyle Kettleson's voice teacher, to do a quick digital fall link. On opening night, after Liu's suicide in the middle of Act 3, Toscanini stopped conducting, turned to the audience and said, "Here the opera ends, because at this point the maestro died." And that was how Turandot ended that first night, with the audience silently filing out of the theater. The next night, they premiered Alfano's finished version, which is what we perform today. Alfano's original ending, the one that he was required to throw out, has been occasionally performed. And in 2001, composer Luciano Berio made a new completion. It premiered to mixed reviews and so didn't enter the repertoire. Now let's go to Germany for a few fun decades. And interestingly, we start with a link to Turandot. Almost 2 decades before Puccini, Ferruccio Busoni composed a Turandot suite, an orchestral work based on Gozzi's play. It premiered in 1906 and was later used as incidental music for the play itself. In 1916, Busoni turned his Turandot suite into a 2-act opera with spoken dialogue, which premiered in 1917, 5 years before Puccini's version. Anyway, that's not Busoni's unfinished opera, just the sort of random thing I can never resist inserting into these talks. The subtitle of Opera Novice is Things I Find Interesting, so you get to hear about. Busoni's unfinished piece is Dr. Faust. He wrote his own libretto based on the Faust legend. As in all versions, Faust sells his soul to Mephistopheles, seduces a young woman and is responsible for her brother's death, and then goes on to commit more sins before seeking salvation and dying. The plot is not linear, though. One modern stage director referred to it as a loose assemblage of situations. Interestingly, for those who know the various other operas based on Faust, in this opera, Mephistopheles is a tenor, not a bass. Busoni started work on the opera in 1916. His libretto was published 2 years later, but work on the music was slow. In 1921, he wrote, "Like a subterranean river, heard but not seen, the music for Faust roars and flows continually in the depths of my aspirations." Busoni died from heart failure in 1924, with Dr. Faust incomplete. His pupil Philip Jarnik finished the score, and the opera premiered in 1925. It was performed in most of the opera houses of Germany within the next few years, reaching London in 1937 and the US in the 1960s. In the 1980s, a new completion was done using newly discovered Busoni sketches. So Dr. Faust does get done, but it's a fairly large undertaking in terms of cast, dramaturgy, and musical difficulty. It is very worth seeing if you get the chance. Staying in Germany, we have 2 unfinished operas that are somewhat connected, and both were disrupted by the Nazis. First up is Alban Berg's Lulu. Its title character is a mysterious young woman who goes through a succession of husbands and lovers, both male and female, across Europe. She commits murder a few times, winds up a streetwalker in London, and is murdered by Jack the Ripper. Very femme fatale with difficult serialist music. Berg had had a massive success with his opera Wozzeck in 1929, after which he began work on Lulu. He based it on the 2 Lulu plays by Frank Wedekind and wrote his own libretto. But it was the early 1930s and the Nazis were coming to power. Although Berg was not Jewish, he had studied with Arnold Schoenberg, who was, and so the Nazis deemed Berg's own music degenerate. Berg worked on the score of Lulu in his secluded country home. In spring 1934, he learned that the premiere of Lulu would not be allowed. So he stopped working on the opera and turned some of the music into the Lulu suite for soprano and orchestra. It premiered in Berlin that fall and was well received by the audience, but condemned by the authorities. Nazi Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels publicly equated a tonality like Berg's with, quote, the Jewish intellectual infection, unquote. A propaganda piece suggested that any reviewer who gave positive notices to the Lulu suite should be fired. Berg died suddenly in 1935 from blood poisoning caused by an insect bite. The 3rd act of Lulu was only partially scored, but the incomplete version premiered in Zurich in 1937. Berg's widow, Helene, asked Schoenberg, his teacher, to complete the orchestration. Schoenberg said yes, but then changed his mind. Helene then prohibited anyone else from completing the opera, so it was limited to the 2 existing acts for the next 40 years. After Helene died, the opera was finally completed, premiering in 1979. This means that when the Met first did Lulu in 1977, they did it in 2 acts. A couple years later, they simply added scenery and costumes for the newly completed Act 3. Lulu has remained in the repertoire ever since, a fascinating piece that is musically close to impossible, but dramatically irresistible. So going back to Arnold Schoenberg, Alban Berg's teacher who had refused to complete Lulu. So pause, although Berg was Schoenberg's student, there was only an 11-year age difference between the two of them, so their careers overlap. Schoenberg had his own unfinished opera, and like Berg, was writing his own libretto. This was Moses and Aaron. Telling of Moses and his brother Aaron as they lead the Israelites into the desert, it starts with a burning bush, includes the golden calf, and is largely a philosophical discussion between Moses and Aaron about the nature of God and faith. Its roots were in a play Schoenberg had written in 1926 called The Biblical Way, which was a response to growing anti-Semitism in Germany. The central protagonist was partially modeled on Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern Zionism, and it was an intensely political, as opposed to religious play. Now in his late 50s, Schoenberg initially thought of turning his play into an oratorio before making it into an opera. He composed the first two acts between 1930 and 1932, but composed only a few sketches from Act 3. He then put it aside. He fled the Nazis in 1933, eventually settling in Los Angeles, where he became a professor at UCLA and the music director of the LA Philharmonic. So digression for a story. In the early 1940s, Schoenberg wrote a piano concerto, which turned out to be one of his final works. Upon being told that it was so difficult that a pianist would need 6 fingers on each hand to perform it, Schoenberg responded, "I can wait." Schoenberg died in 1951, with Moses and Aaron not much further along than it had been in 1932. The opera's first 2 acts were given in concert in 1954 and then staged in Zurich in 1957, followed by London and Boston. In 2010, a Hungarian composer completed the last act, but the opera is still almost always performed as Schoenberg left it, i.e. only the first 2 acts. I'll add that it is a monstrously hard piece musically, a 12-tone opera that is almost a math problem, and it has an enormous cast and orchestra and chorus. I was working at the Metropolitan Opera when they did their first production of it in 1999. To put it in perspective, a new production of something like Lucia di Lammermoor or Carmen might have 3 or 4 weeks of rehearsal. Moses and Aaron had 10 weeks. Another Schoenberg story. At some point in, doing the joke again, another Schoenberg story. At some point in his time in the US, he was asked, "Are you Arnold Schoenberg, the composer?" He nodded, but explained, "No one else wanted the job, so I had to take it on." So Moses and Aaron seems like a good place to stop our chronological tour. As always, my notes say, and now a snazzy conclusion, but I don't really have one. I hope you enjoyed the journey into assorted operas and composers. You may have known some of it. I suspect you didn't know all of it. If you want to take away any piece of wisdom from this talk, it's that there is no such thing as a composer simply knocking out perfect operatic masterpieces. There are always mistakes along the way, digressions to other operas, and sometimes just throwing in the towel and moving on to the next thing. You know, like life. Okay, time for questions. If you're watching this live, please type your questions into the YouTube conversation box so I can see them. And if you're watching this after November 5th, please feel free to just email me at info@madisonopera.org. Okay, so going to questions. I'll just start. Hi, Lynn. How were composers and librettists paired up historically? In the 19th century, it was basically like the librettist worked for the opera company, and it'd basically be like the head of the company would hire the composer and the librettist and say, "Hey, you're doing an opera together, figure it out." Definitely the case of how Paris Opera worked. For Mozart, interestingly, he seemed to have to go find his own librettos. And in his letters, he's very specific about how much he hates most of the librettos he finds until he works with Lorenzo da Ponte. I did notice as I was working my way through this that in the 20th century, most of these composers were writing their own libretto. That was the case with Debussy, with Busoni, with Berg, with Schoenberg. And I don't know if it's just there was no longer the school of librettos or it was just like total control. But it definitely was notable to me that modern composers seem to want to write their own libretto, for better or worse. Are there any rumored to exist operas that have never been found? Oh dear. I feel like there must be, but none so famous that they have crossed my radar of being like Verdi's King Lear is probably the most like opera that never was that people wish they could find. Definitely, like Tales of Hoffman, what's interesting on Tales of Hoffman is they're still pretty much finding the score to it. It seems like every time you turn around, they've found more music to it. But no, I don't know of any other rumored to exist operas. On the other hand, I always feel like the basement of the Paris Opera House must just be full of boxes of stuff and other things will turn up. Oh, another just quick question. Who actually composed Nessun Dorma? That is Puccini. Like that's the hit tune that was composed by Puccini. So in the opera Turandot, he sings the aria. Then there's that weird scene with the slave Lulu, who has this great dramatic finish and commits suicide, and it's like the best part of the opera. And then that's pretty much the point at which Puccini died, and you can tell because the rest is just dramatically and musically downhill from there. Like after Lulu dies, there is just no point. So Nessun Dorma is definitely Puccini. Although the trick on Nessun Dorma, if you see it in context, is that he fiendishly did not allow for applause. As written, like he sings the whole thing and the orchestra just keeps going. And so the conductor always has to decide, like, do we stop and wait for applause or do we just go in? You didn't ask that, but you know, I'm in control. Are there unfinished operas by famous composers who are still living? Interesting question. I mean, yes, in the sense that I think some composers are always still working on things. I'm trying to think when I do my survey of American operas, if I know what all is out there. I mean, I feel like composers now take 5 to 10 years to write a piece. I mean, back in the 19th century, Donizetti was just knocking them out. And now it feels like every composer, it takes 10 years. So I would assume that composers like Jake Heggie, Mark Adamo, Laura Kaminsky, all have pieces that are not yet done that we haven't heard. The question will be, with new technology, do they find a way to record everything at some point? Do they scan their scores rather than shove them in a box in the back of the basement of the Paris Opera House? I don't know. So are there any other questions? I understand there is a Packers game on right now, as well as, you know, the whole year 2020 thing. Okay. Oh. When operas are completed, I expect there is argument about whether the new composer can produce music that is up to the original composers. Which opera completions do you think are the best? Well, obviously not Turandot. The question of whether one knows is best depends on how well one knows the original music, right? So I would argue that Hoffmann, which people just randomly keep completing, the people who are writing it do a fabulous job, because the fact is we actually use some of the music that Offenbach didn't write for the opera because it's better than what Offenbach did. I've never honestly heard the Duke of Alba. I'm not likely to, so I don't know on that one. Khovanschina, having seen Khovanschina, I could not tell you that it had been done by 5 different composers. Debussy, I think the Debussy completions are fine, but none of them have been considered great enough to make it really worth keeping. And I say that having actually studied Debussy with one of the women who completed one of the versions. Yeah, to me, an opera completion is best if you can't tell that the original composer didn't do it, I would say. I mean, obviously, at the time, there's always people who said, the guy who completed Meyerbeer's last name was Feti, and there were people who said he just destroyed Meyerbeer's music. There are people who said, who cares, Meyerbeer wasn't very good anyway. People will argue for days on end. Okay, are there any other last questions? There's like this lag between when they're typed and when I see them, so I'm pausing for a moment. Okay, So I'm going to draw this Opera Novice to a close. Thank you for tuning in wherever and whenever you are watching this. Our next digital fall event is Opera Up Close Cocktail Hour on Sunday, November 15th, in which we talk to members of our chorus, plus our chorus master, Anthony Kale. Please join us for the conversation. And then on Saturday, November 21st, we have our third live from the Madison Opera Center performance, starring Emily Fons and Amanda Majeski with pianist Scott Gendel. As always, I'm grateful that you are spending your time with us. I hope this distracted you for a little bit and that you have a wonderful evening.